Welcome back. Here we are at phase 2 of the coding process with Canon 2. This time around, Logan's going to code in a simple game engine. That's our mission. And once again, we will be following our implementation plan that we shared with you guys earlier. I'd also like to point out that Logan has got 2 copies of Visual Studio Express running, don't you, Logan?
Right. One's over here that you see now, and the other one has Canon 1 in it.
Ooh, if you look in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see on the title bar, Canon 1. So we've got the second copy of Visual Studio open so that Logan can go in here and copy code when necessary. There is no reason to retype everything that's already been typed out once. Right, Logan?
Right, there's a lot of things, a lot of specifics and variables and methods where we will be doing the exact same thing as we did done in Canon 1, so there's no reason to retype every single last thing.
Exactly. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump back over to our Canon 2 game. There we go. And I think the first thing we should probably do is save the project and copy our images to the appropriate folder.
Right, we'll go ahead and get those set up ahead of time.
Okay.
So let's save the project, and Canon 2 is fine for the name, so we'll save that. Now we need to dump the images folder in the same folder as the executable, just like in Canon 1. So I'm going to bring up a folder with some images in it, copy all the images, and then go to our projects folder inside of Visual Studio 2005 for the folder. So here we've got Canon 2, the project folder. We'll jump into Canon 2, then into bin, then into debug, and paste the images in.
All right, so now we are set up with images and ready to go. So Logan, let us take a look at our implementation plan. Very first thing was graphical assets, and you have now put them in the appropriate folder. The next thing was objects. Let's go ahead and create the player picture box, the target picture box, the projectile picture box, lives display picture box, and the title screen picture box.
Right, we need to get all of the picture boxes created back on the form. So I'm going to switch over to the form designer, and now I'm going to bring up the toolbox so that we can get to some picture boxes and grab the first picture box, drop it into place, and then probably just copy and then paste a few times. So this second one can be maybe our target, and then maybe our projectile, maybe something like a title screen, and then maybe a lives display.
Okay, now let's go ahead and spend just a moment, and with a few of these, I think you want to set the sizes.
And just to give us more room to work with, I'm also going to close up the toolbox.
Absolutely.
Alright, we need to set up sizes, and we need to set up names. So let's grab this first one, which can be our player. For the size, the same as Canon 1. We want a 32 by 32 picture box. And we want to set the name to player picture box. I want to keep picture box in the name of all of these, just to make it very clear which object is a picture box and which object is a game item.
Okay.
So let's capitalize picture box, and this is going to be the player picture box.
And go ahead and select picture box and Control-C it just to make it simpler for naming.
Oh, I got you.
Yeah, I'm getting lazy now, and I'm not even
I was looking at the picture box, and I was like, but I already made 5 of them.
Okay, so the next one, let's go ahead and do our target picture box.
Alright, we've got our target
and Control
picture
V.
box.
Very nice. And then our projectile picture box.
Alright, projectile picture box.
Okay. Now our lives display picture box.
Okay. Let's see, we've got lives display picture box.
Okay, and finally our title screen picture box.
Alright, title, capital T, screen picture box.
Beautiful. All right, let's go and revisit our... Which one did you stop with the
projectile
sizing? Actually, no. Was it the second one that you stopped with the sizing, or did you?
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah, that's okay. I was keeping track. So we'll go ahead and down and a little bit further.
Yeah, we've got
that's location. There you go. And 32 by 32. Getting these sizes in place.
All right, so that's our target. And I don't think that's
no,
set
it's not set. You only... Yeah, I guess it just...
I guess I typed it and didn't
hit
commit it or something.
That's cool. All right.
All right, player, target, and then we've got projectile.
Okay.
Projectile needs to be 8 by 8.
Okay.
And we're not going to worry about the lives display or the title screen because we've got a HUD item coming up that'll take care of all of that.
Sounds good. Okay, looking back over here at the implementation plan, the next thing you did was created 2 timers, the update timer and the draw timer.
Okay, then we will need the toolbox back.
That'll come and go.
So let's bring the toolbox back. And let's go down to components. And from components, let's grab a timer and drop a timer in. And while we're at it, let's grab another timer and drop another timer in because we know we're going to need 2 of them.
Okay.
So let's go to the first timer. This can be our update timer. We're driving the engine's update functionality. So this is our update timer. I'll go ahead and enable it, and I'll set its interval to 16.
Okay.
Now I'll grab the other timer.
It's got a little UI glitch down there. Okay, draw timer.
Enable it, and set its interval to 16 as well. We'll come back to the ability to change these later once we get the engine itself working.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, looking back over the implementation plan, the very next thing we had listed was variables copy from Canon 1.
Okay. As a matter of fact, and there's one other thing I want to do which I might not have written down on that. In order to mimic XNA just a little bit, we were going to rename the form 1
Absolutely.
to game 1.
Okay.
Because we're kind of using the form as the home for all of the game stuff. It also asks if we want to rename references, and we'll tell it yes, because we do want to refer to this as game 1 in code.
Right.
I mean, not that we're going to be referring to it, but we'll see it. And now we need to look at variables. So let's look at the code for game 1, which happens to be open. And inside of here, we need to set up our variables for the game.
Okay, and we've got marked in here. Let's copy these from Canon 1. So let's jump over to Canon 1, and the things that we're looking for are screen width, screen height, projectile speed, base target speed, collision distance, starting lives, game difficulty control, lives, title width, and we've also got is game running, lives, level, and random.
Okay, so the only thing we're leaving out is target velocity.
Okay, so just grab everything. We'll delete those two out when we paste it over there in the new game.
Alright, so from the first constant down to the random,
okay,
copy all of that, jump over to our new Canon 2, jump in right before the constructor for game 1, and paste all of these in.
Okay, perfect. Now let's go ahead and delete out our 2 ints that we don't need for target velocities. Alright, and why don't we need those, ladies and gentlemen? That's right, I'm sure you just said because velocity information is now stored in the game item. Beautiful. Okay, so the next thing, Logan, we had in our implementation plan was skeleton, the engine methods, and one mechanics method. So we're going to go ahead and get initialize, load graphics content, update scene, draw scene, and finally update player skeleton in.
Okay, and most of those were engine methods, so I'm going to define a region for engine methods. And a region for mechanics methods.
Okay.
And let's see, finish off the end region, and there we go. So inside of engine methods, we'll begin with initialize.
Sounds good.
It's going to be a private method. It doesn't return anything, and it's called initialize.
Alright, next we wanted to do was our load graphics content.
Okay. Private void load graphics content. And block that in.
Okay.
Next.
Next thing we wanted to do was our update scene.
Okay. Private void update scene.
Which in XNA you will see this as simply update. And then finally we've got draw scene.
Okay. Private void draw scene.
Okay, now let's go ahead and put in, now that was the finally for our engine methods, let's go ahead and put in the one mechanics method, so which is update player.
Okay, this will also be a private void method called update player. So a little bit of blocking, and that takes care of update player.
Alright, fantastic. Now, turning our attention back over to our implementation plan, as we are being so good following this, next was set the form client size and call initialize.
Alright, we need to take our constant screen width and screen height into account and set the client size much like we did in Canon 1. So I'll jump down to the constructor for game 1. I'll jump down one line below initialize component, or we can say this, of course, again meaning this form, dot client size is equal to a new size of screen width by screen height. Alright?
Right. Very good. And now we needed to call initialize.
Alright, so a simple quick call to initialize.
Well, I'm going to check that off. Alright. Next thing we had was call load graphics content from our form load.
Alright. Now, we don't have a form load event handler yet, so we'll jump back to design.
Okay.
We'll grab our form, we'll go to its events, and we'll look for the load event. So we'll bring in a load event. And before I code this in, I do want to move this up, keep all of our events together. And since this is the first event, I think I'll also go ahead and define a region for it. So let me paste game load backup right below the constructor and start a region. And just call this, not $region, we'll do £, region called events.
Suddenly thought I was in another language.
And we'll end that off with an end region. Alright, so inside of load, you said we wanted to call load graphics
content. Yep.
So load graphics, there's load graphics content, and it is in place.
Okay, very good. Now we need to go ahead and call update scene and draw scene from the timer. So we need to go ahead and create their tick events.
Okay. I could jump into, actually let's jump to design. Let's grab our timer, first one, and there's our tick event, or I could of course just double click on it here in the designer.
Go ahead and move it.
And
or do you want to do them both at the same time?
Yeah, both at the same time, I agree. We'll take the draw timer, set up an event handler for it as well. Now we'll take both of these, cut them, and move them back up to our event section right below load.
Okay.
Alright, update timer. We needed to call update scene.
Mm-hmm.
So we have our update scene. There's our update scene method.
Okay.
Draw timer needs to call draw scene.
Exactly.
So there's our draw scene method.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, so now what we needed to do is focus our attention on initialize. See, now we've got things kind of jumping around to the appropriate areas. In initialize, let's do something. Let's go ahead and create the random object.
Okay, because if you remember, we copied the random object variable from the Canon 1 game, but we're not doing anything with it yet. So we're going to jump down to initialize, and we'll create it. We'll say that random is equal to a new random.
Cool. Okay, so now we've got that knocked out of the way. Now it's time to start focusing. I did it again. I did that earlier too. So it's time to start focusing on some functionality. The player item. Now what I'd like to do is get a player moving with the mouse, basically. So first thing we need to do is we need to make a player item variable, just a player. Okay.
Let's jump back up to the top where we have our variables. I'll jump in right after the random, and let's say we want to make a new game item called player.
Okay, so now that you've got it, the next part of this was initialize it.
Alright, let's jump down to initialize, jump below random. I'll add in an extra line below random, and we'll say that our player is equal to new game item.
Alright, so now that we've got them, we need to load information. We need to load that image into the picture box. And we also need to link that picture box to the player.
Right. So let's address the picture box first. Let's take our player picture box, and there it is. We'll tell it to load in the file player.png.
Okay.
Now we need to turn around and make sure that our player game item is aware of this and remembers it in its texture property. So we can take our player, set its texture to player picture box.
Excellent. Okay, so now that we have that done, we need to call update player from within update scene.
Alright, so let's jump down. We have update scene, where we will call update player.
Okay, and wow, this is going really fast. Now we need to call on our draw in draw scene.
Alright, so in draw scene we need to address player and tell it to draw.
Alright, so now we just need to code in the update player so that we can start taking our mouse into account.
As a matter of fact, let me do a build and test.
Okay.
Build just to make sure everything's working well, and aside from a few warnings, it is.
Fantastic.
Let's play, and let's see. We should see, there's the player graphic sticking half off screen. So, and of course it's not following the mouse because while we have a skeleton for update player, obviously we don't have code in it yet.
Right. Okay, so we need to go ahead and get a little bit of code into place. So it is time to do update player.
Alright, now this is interesting because this is the first time we've had to go and pull for information, whereas in previous cases we just waited for information to be handed to us.
Right.
So again, the idea is to take our player and set it to wherever the mouse is. Of course, being locked to the bottom of the screen, but I'm going to try to show this step by step. So we'll begin with just getting the mouse's location.
Okay.
And because we're inside of the control, that's actually rather convenient. We have it available as the mouse position property. So to begin with, let me do this really simply. We'll just take our player game item. We'll set its position to be wherever the mouse is. So player.position equals mouse position. And there's mouse position, and there we go.
Okay.
So let's see what this does. So we run, but check it out. We have a little bit of a problem.
Just a little.
The player's position is significantly offset from the cursor. Now let me show what's going on. The mouse position is retrieved in screen or overall screen space. So you see if I move the mouse up to the very top left corner of the screen, then our player is at the top left corner of the form. And that's the offset we're getting. However far the form is away from this corner is how far that it's offsetting.
Right.
So I can actually move it closer, and then it seems closer. Or move it farther away, and then there's a more significant gap. So we need to address this. We need to translate the point from the string to being a point within the client area on the form itself. So we need to look at a method that's held within control called point to client. We need to call that for whatever controller we're looking at, and we're looking at the client area of the form is what we're trying to translate to.
That's right. So this form.
So we need to say this form dot point to client, and then feed it a point that we want to check, which is mouse position. So this should translate our mouse position, and it's something relevant to this form.
Okay.
So let's run and test. And there we go, much better.
Wow.
So no matter where the form is, if we move the form up, still centered. If we move the form down, still centered.
And better yet, think about how we set up the game item class a little earlier. Look at where your mouse is.
Dead center of the player.
Dead center, not top left. Very cool.
All right, well, that has the player moving, but we need to finish off the way the player is supposed to behave. It's supposed to be constrained to the bottom of the screen.
Correct.
So let's get that into place. Now, obviously, we're going to need to handle the X and Y differently. Y needs to be constrained, X needs to be where the mouse is. So I'm going to define two integer variables just to make this a little bit more clear when writing it out. We're going to have an integer for player X, and player X...
Not for player X, but called player X.
called player X, just a temporary holder for X. Now, this one's going to be simple because it's just going to be wherever the translated mouse position is in X. As a matter of fact, I can just copy this whole line and paste it. But, of course, this is a point, so we need to address it just only part of this result. So I'll add dot X. So we get the point to client of the mouse point, but only use its dot X, and then turn around and store that in player X. Now let's find where we need to put the player's Y at. So I'm going to define a variable for player Y, and we'll set that to be the screen height. But of course we don't want it to be half sunk through the floor, so we need to subtract a little bit.
That's right. Remember, screen height right now, we are dealing with the center of these picture boxes. So that means it's going to be halfway through the floor, as Logan just said.
As a matter of fact, I can go ahead and show that. We'll correct it as a final step.
Okay.
Let me just set it to screen height, so we just set it to the very bottom of the screen, or at least what we think should be the very bottom. So let's turn around and use our player X and player Y to set the player's position. So I'm going to wipe out the point to client, and instead replace this with a new point. And X will be player X, and Y will be player Y. And let's run and test and see where this has us for screen height.
Halfway through the floor.
Exactly. So still following our methodology where the center of the picture box is what's used, or the center of the player item.
Okay.
So to correct this, of course we need to subtract a little bit from game height to get the player back up on the screen. But unlike before, this isn't the entire height because we're only halfway through the floor, so we only need half the height. But that's what origin does. It gets half the width or height. So we could call upon the player's origin property, but of course we only need part of that, so we'll only take the Y component of that. We'll store that in player Y.
And that should do the trick.
And there we are, nicely constrained to the bottom of the screen.
Wow, everything's working.
And working quite well, too.
Did this go a lot faster than you thought it would? Because really, that's it.
That's true. That was the goal, get the player working and get the engine working. I guess we can go back and recap how the engine's working.
Yeah, I would definitely want to do that. Go ahead, and I'll let you ramble on about this one.
Okay. So what we've done so far is we've set up our 4 key engine methods. We have initialize, load graphics content, update scene, and draw scene. Inside of initialize, we do things like set up our items. So we get our random ready, even though we're not using it yet. We do want that ready to be used later. And we get our player set up, so we create a new player and get that ready for use. Then inside of load graphics content, we do things like loading actual images, and then as we're loading them, we also handle the association with the player. This was just done because it makes sense because we're working with textures here. Technically, you could move this to initialize and it would still work just fine, but we chose to keep it with all of the graphics content.
Okay.
From there, we have update scene, and for right now, all we're doing is calling update player, so we move the player around.
And remember, that update player is being called every game tick from that timer.
Right, and then we have draw scene, which is just calling upon the player's draw ability. You'll notice that we have a special case for update player instead of calling player.update. That's because inside of game item, update was for making the game item move on its own, making it move by velocity. Here, it was almost like a special case. Player is a special kind of game item. Right. It moves by mouse instead of by velocity, and that's what the update player method is for. And then, of course, we had to code in the move player or update player itself, where we translated the position of the mouse to be relevant in screen client or in the client area or client. What am I trying to say? Coordinates.
Right.
And of course, restoring the X and Y just to make it easier to write out, and finally setting the player's position.
Now, the big thing to focus on is when we launch the actual application, what takes place. We've got a constructor, we have a load, we have an initialize. How do things get hit?
Right. Well, first we load, so we hit the constructor for the form, and we set up our size, and then call upon initialize. So it's as the form is getting created that we actually call initialize and create our objects.
Okay.
And then the other events load after the form itself loads. So after we've already run through constructor and then the form itself is created and loaded, then we go and load all of our graphics content, which we saw a second ago. And then finally we've got our two timers.
And they start automatically, and they begin at that point calling our two methods that are just going to serve as the heart of the game, if you will, or the heart of the game engine.
Right.
Okay, and that's pretty much it. So that is going to wrap it up for this video. We have a very simple engine in place, and we will continue on with Phase 3 in the next video. Thanks a lot.